All right, young Mr. Dalton, could I ask you to pray for us and open us? Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, this day, I pray that we will all learn the insights, wisdom, and teachers. I pray that you are safe and drive home.
Was that it? Yeah. Okay, sorry. I missed the amen. I beg your pardon. It's my fault. Okay. So we are on chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a deep dive into the LGBTQ+, and I'm going to shorten that as we discuss it. It's a deep dive into that movement. Okay? We're going to make this hopefully a little brief because we don't need to deep dive into it. We're seeing it every day. But I think it's helpful as a case study for us to understand why these things, these movements, work. So when you see this analyzed in chapter 7, what we want to remember is it's not just LGB. It's also environmentalism. It's the racism movement. It's climate change movement, which is different than environmentalism. It's the feminism movement. It's all these sub-movements. And we're going to examine that basically using the LGB case study as a model. Does that make sense? So what we want to start with is this, because this is the way we're wired. We're born into time. This is a long road into the beginning of time. We're born into a time, into our culture, into our country, into our living arrangements, whatever it is. But we're part of something that has gone before, and now we exist today in something that existed before us. We fit into it, and then we see that the way that we fit in and what we do matters as time goes on to our children and to our children's children. So there's context, there's meaning, there's purpose, there's a sense of place in history, and all of this under God, because we know it's good, it's right, it's perfect, even if we, as this little brick right here, are looking around at all the other little bricks and going, this is crazy and I do not understand all of this. But because God is sovereign, and because this is His timeline that He created and He orchestrates over all things, I can trust that my purpose, my place, my meaning is real and good, and that the contribution I make, however infinitesimally small, matters. So I can trust all of that. Now, the reason why we want to emphasize this is not just for review. It's because this is the way that we were wired. God created Adam and Eve to be in the garden. He gave them tasks to do. They were to be the original parents, and they had stuff. They had stuff to do. They had purpose and meaning. And there was a sense of place, geographically, but also that they were the first parents, that they were honoring God, that they were all these things. So we were wired this way from creation pre-fall. And that's important to remember because the counterfeits come along. We said that, I have a marker here somewhere. Got one. What we said is that Satan doesn't necessarily create out of whole cloth. He's a corrupter. He's a poisoner. He takes what is and what's good and what God has created and he taints it just a little bit so that eventually it just grows like a cancer inside of what's good and makes what's good and the way that we're wired and the way that it was created wrong. Makes it wrong. So what we said last week was, you know what? There's a lot of this around here. So with the LGBT, and what they're doing is they're saying LGBT goes all the way back to the Bible. And there's gender studies about the Bible. There's LGBT about the Bible. There's environmentalism in the Bible. Did you know that Jesus was gay? I mean, all of these things. And it's important that you know the history of your movement because those that follow after you won't experience the persecution and the hardships and the oppression that you're experiencing today because you're going to be part of something that frees that up into the future. Does all of this sound familiar? Yes, it does. And there's a reason why it works. It's because when you substitute anything down here but copy the model, we're wired to it. And I want to show us that in Scripture. So let's look at a couple of scriptures, and then we'll get to our chapter. But let's open our Bibles. And we're going to look at, first of all, the positive. Let's go to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11. Mitch, could I pick on you? Oh, sorry. Hebrews 11. If you've got a Bible handy. Aiden, you'll be Hebrews 12. Is that okay? So, Mitch, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 through 16. If I could get you to stand up and project that nice and loudly. Now, remember in the top of our outline, plastic people, liquid world. We know what that's about, right? Now we're talking about imagined communities and that we are designed to be communal. There's a reason why imagined communities work. We went over that last week, that we have to conceptualize ourselves as part of something greater. But that's God-given. It's also eminently biblical. But when we drop it down here and substitute God with some other cause, that's when it's sinful. That's when it's sinful. But it's God-given to be part of an imagined community. Go ahead. Yes, sir. And chapter 11 in Hebrews, just by reminder, is the Hall of Fame of faith. So it's talking about Noah, talking about Abraham, talking about Moses. How did they live these unique lives in the situation, their historical context? How did they live by faith? Well, this is how. Go ahead.
All these people were still living by faith, but they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw him and welcomed him for a visit. Admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they left, they would have had an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
Perfect. So you've got these people, these heroes of the faith, whatever country they're part of, they were imagining that heavenly country. And then chapter 12. Aiden, if you'd stand up and read that for me. Verses 22 through 24, please.
But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festival gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks to a better world than the blood of Abel.
Thank you. So what that's talking about, and this is written to people experiencing the discipline of God. It's written to encourage them. And what you're supposed to do is imagine what you're going to. This spiritual assembly with all of the heroes of the faith will be there. Your relatives that died in the faith will be there. Your children, if they precede you, that died in the faith will be there. Jesus himself, God, the Father, will be there. And they'll all be rejoicing. And that is meant in this world to carry us through whatever hardship God gives us to live for him. And remember, whatever hardship that is, whatever country we're born into, whatever familial context we're born into, economic circumstances we're born into, physical hardships we suffer, deaths, or whatever it is, we're meant to do it as part of this. But the way that we do this is to imagine being home with him and all of the people of God, and that this is our citizenship, this is our home. And all of that is in here and in here, and we're meant to do that. And then what does Satan love to do? Take it down. Take a little bit of poison. Oh, that wine is lovely. Let's open that bottle. It smells delicious. Oh, wait. the whole wine bottle is then corrupted. Everything is corrupted. Everything is tainted and made impure. So let's read about that aspect, because again, we have that in the scriptures. Let's go to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Now again, this is the old and the new, right? We read the scripture, oh, there's nothing new under the sun. And in many ways, that is true. But then the methodology can shift a little bit, or things can be accelerated by technology, or other things that we didn't have 200, 300, 500 years ago. But we get there in the same way. There's still that similar nature of it. All right, Romans 1. Let's do 21 through 32. Rachel, could I ask you to read that for us nice and loud? Romans 1, 21 to 32. Go ahead and stand up and project it that way. Got it? Oh, well, if you're... 21 through the end of the chapter, through 32. And I may pause you in between.
For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things.
So pause there real quick. So what this is saying, we're familiar with this text conceptually, but they're exchanging God for something else. And she listed a bunch of things. The scripture lists a bunch of things. Man, four-footed animals, birds and beasts, or whatever. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because what it is, it's just a flag flying over the top of the building, but what you fill that fake religion up with is man-made. Oh, I worship the wolves. Really? Well, what do the wolves tell you to do? Well, the wolves tell me to turn around 3 times, click my heels, and then wish for being home, and then I can be home. Is that what the wolves tell you? Okay. And I know that's silly, it's from the Wizard of Oz, but it is just that silly. It is just that silly. When you think about some of the causes that sit here, and the rules that are made up, and the things that you end up doing, dressing like a girl, if you're a guy, with a beard. That's how silly it can be. But that's what it's talking about. When you see that you're replacing God with four-footed animals, wings, and this, that, and the other, just put over the top of that man-made religion. Now here's the key part as you go forward.
Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped a certain nature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever.
Pause there. What are they doing? They've exchanged the truth for the lie, and then what do they do? What's that?
They worshiped the created things, not the Creator.
Yes, they worshipped. They worshipped. So we get caught up in Romans 1. I think we'll stop there. Thank you. Actually, keep your finger there because we'll read 32. We get caught up in the activities of Romans 1, don't we? Oh, that's the sin of homosexuality. Oh, that's the sin of worshiping the wrong thing. Oh, and that's true. But when you worship something, think about this context. Who you are, your very identity, is determined by God. And He places you here sovereignly for His purpose, function, and what have you, so that this will go forward according to His will into eternity, and all of that is placed by God. So He's in charge, and you're a part of His plan. So your identity, you come up and you say, I am a Christian. And you mean it, because that's who you are. You're going to read quotes in the book today, chapter 7. Well, I'm a lesbian. That's who I am. It's my identity. I'm a gay man. It's my identity. It's who I am. I'm this. I'm a feminist. It's who I am. It's my identity. So they've exchanged this And they said, no, actually, this is my past, it's my present, and it's the cause of my future. And it orders my entire life. Because I live like a feminist. I will die like a feminist. I will publish books like a feminist. I will go to rallies for feminism. And I will promulgate it to others. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, oh yes, I know so-and-so and they're LGBT, and whenever they get a chance to talk about it, they will. Yeah, they will. They used to talk about Christians that way. Doggone Christians evangelizing all the time. We still do. All right, so let's read 32, the very last verse of chapter 1. This is also important.
Though they knew God's righteous decree to those that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them.
What does that last part of the verse say? What's that? They give approval. They praise them. They evangelize them. They bring them from without, and they try to push them within. And everybody must give them recognition. Just like we would say. Who do we say must have the glory? God. And if you come here and you want to be a worshiper here, you have to profess His name. And you have to live your life in accordance with His will. You have to promulgate this to others. And you have to learn and grow in your understanding of Him and His glory and His Word. And see yourself as a Christian. That's your identity. Bought and paid for by the blood of Jesus Christ. Is this all sounding familiar? Now substitute something else. This is why it works. We're wired this way. And the Bible tells us that we will substitute God for something else all the time. And even we as Christians know it. There are times when we can get caught up in something and we're like, oh man, I've made an idol out of blank, whatever it is. Right? We know it, we feel it, we can sense it. We don't succumb to it ultimately. We have the Holy Spirit of God. But we don't live in it. But you're going to read about people in here, and I'm skipping a lot of stuff in the chapter. I recommend you read it, but it's less important. But this is who they are. It's their identity. So I just wanted us to see that this is true and right. This is corrupted by Satan. Fill in the blank. But there's a reason why this works. It's because it's the way that it was designed. Make sense? Perfect. All right, chapter 7. Let's go ahead and read his introduction. Let's go to page 129, paragraphs 1 and 2. Shirley Long, could I ask you to read that nice and loud for us? Page 129.
The letters LGBTQ+ loom large in the cultural and political imagination of our day. The coalition of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer people is without a doubt the greatest political success story of the last half-century. In the 1960s, homosexuality was still illegal in many Western countries. Even Barack Obama did not dare to support gay marriage unequivocally until 2012. And yet, today, even to voice dissent from trans ideology is likely to earn one a ferocious social media beating and exclusion from polite liberal society. The speed, depth, and comprehensive scope of the LGBTQ+'s triumphant cultural conquest is impressive. And yet, did you want to say it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yet familiarity with the coalition can easily blind observers to its confected and volatile nature. It is not a movement bound together by a set of intrinsic commonalities shared by its constituent groups, as, say, the Republican or Democratic Party are. Rather, it is a marriage of convenience created by uniquely particular circumstances. Exploring this point is helpful because it is not only helps us to understand the nature of the sexual revolution that we are witnessing today, it also helps us to see what exactly is at stake in all this in terms of where the revolution itself might be heading, and how this will reshape public attitudes toward traditional freedoms such as those of speech and religion. Those latter two topics will be addressed in Chapter 8.
Thank you. So this intro is great because he's basically telling you now, and this is important for our understanding of all of these sub-movements. When you dig into the details of them, they come with this big banner, and they seem very powerful. Social media, news headlines, politicians, etc. Oh, yes. But you look beneath the hood, and the engine is gritty, and it's a mess. It's a mess. It's internally inconsistent. It doesn't work on its face. But you have to get down into the details, which he is going to do. We'll look at L. We're going to look at G and B and T and Q. And we're going to think through how those conflict with each other. But again, you can do this with other things. We'll be mentioning those as we go along. So let's go to page, we're on 130. We need that second paragraph under the heading. Cody, could I ask you to read that for us? Magic book. And there one appears. It's lovely. Page 130. And you'll see the heading LGBT, etc., marriage of convenience. Underneath that, consider first the L and the G. Yes, please.
Consider first the L and the G. Until the early 1980s, lesbians and gay men did not operate as a united coalition. Lesbians saw gay men as enjoying male privilege. For example, a gay man in the workplace was typically not under any pressure to make himself attractive to a female boss in order to improve his professional prospects. A lesbian woman, however, might well find that she was required to play a distinctly feminine, even sexually attractive role in a heterosexual context for career success. In short, gay men were still men, enjoyed the benefits of living in a society that gave an advantageous position to their sex.
Perfect. That's good enough. Thank you very much. So what we're drawing to here, and a lot of us, this is a while ago now, the 80s, the lesbian gay movement was all there was, and it was still pretty out there for most of society. But they were like this. They were like this because of that and other reasons. So let's keep moving. Page 131. Let's see. Dwayne, could I ask you to read 131 at the top paragraph there? Begin at the therefore. It's in the middle of that top paragraph. And just keep reading. I'll stop you. May stop you a few times.
Therefore, in the early 1980s, an interesting and public coalition of the L and G emerged, focused on presenting a united front in the campaign for AIDS research, sex education, and the mainstream acceptance of gay and lesbian people by the wider community. Three things are noteworthy here. First, the coalition arose out of a shared sense of victimhood. As lesbians saw themselves as victims of heteronormative patriarchal society, so they now saw gay men as victims of the same. This is, in part, a function of the broader culture of expressive individualism that tilts towards seeing as virtuous victims those unable to express outwardly that which they feel inwardly. We see here a good example of that politicalization of the sexual self noted in chapter 4.
So pause there. And this reminded me a little bit of the way that God moves the nations around in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, and all of those so-called emperors that were nothing more than pawns in God's hands. So if God wanted to expose the fallacy of this lifestyle as a movement, the AIDS crisis brought them together. They realized that they were better as a coalition, a more powerful coalition, and they saw mutual victimhood. But when you're dealing with heresies start on the fringe. And I say heresies because you're replacing God with something else, right? This is the Romans 1 thing. So you're replacing God with something else. That starts on the fringe almost every time. And by fringe, I mean it's small. But then it gets bigger, and it starts to mass support, and it starts to coalesce, and eventually it gets big enough to when you have to deal with it. And in some ways, technology is helping us deal with things faster. All right, Dwayne, you ready? He just sat down too, sorry. So the second point, and this is another important point, go ahead.
Second, both lesbians and gays and bisexuals assume the importance of biological sex differences. Lesbians are biological women who are sexually attracted to biological men. Gay men are biological men who are sexually attracted to biological men. Bisexuals are those who acknowledge their own biological identity as well as their sexual attraction to others of either biological identity.
Perfect. So have a seat real quick. So there's a verse in Scripture that says you affirm the law even as you break the law. And there's a sense here where the L, the G, and the B affirm the law. They affirm natural law. They're just sinning against it, which we read in Romans. But they're not conflicting with natural law in that way yet. They're not redefining the road. So in a sense, they are plastic people, but the road is not liquid yet. The world is not liquid yet. It's the T that changes everything. Fundamentally at the root. That's what changes everything. Because we even as Christians would look at these individuals and we'd say, your actions are sinful. But they're not redefining what a man and a woman are. They're just sinfully interacting with each other in an ungodly and unscriptural way. But we haven't blown things up yet. Yes, ma'am.
You could say that to a certain extent they are kind of, though, because lesbian women tend to act like men and gay men tend to act like women. So it's kind of already a slippery slope.
Well, it's the direction of trans, isn't it? Because as they take on characteristics, for those that couldn't hear, you could say, look, you could say they're already starting to blur those lines because lesbian women tend to act more mannish and I'm getting all my letters mixed up. Gay men tend to act more feminine, and that's true. You start to blur those lines. But where they really start to push it is when they come out in academic articles and journals and all these things and saying, no, it has always been so from the beginning of time to the end of time, etc. And we'll get there. So let's read that third principle, Dwayne.
Third, standing in significant tension with the second point, in aligning themselves with gay men, lesbians set aside the importance of biology with its significance for how different sexes experience the world and relate to patriarchal society and to sexual acts themselves, in order to present a common front against a common enemy, heteronormative society. In retrospect, this was a critical move because it ultimately paved the way for the addition of the T and the Q to the alliance on the basis that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Perfect.
Do you guys remember your Rousseau? What was the essence of his philosophy? We've got to break out. We've got to rebel against the norms. Well, here it's the heteronormative society. It's the patriarchal society, man-led families. We've got to break out. Well, here it is. And that foundation has been laid hundreds of years earlier. All right, so let's keep moving to trans ideology. Trans ideology. And we're going to pick up, Nathan, are you ready for me? We're going to pick up so many threads of chapters 1 through 6. I just wanted us to read this because he's been building to get here. This is how we went plastic in our mindset about ourselves and how we now think of the world as something liquid that we can just manipulate. Go ahead, Nathan.
You're wanting...
The origins of trans ideology, and just go right on down.
That's on page 134?
Sorry, 132.
The origins of trans ideology arguably go back to the 19th century. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels noted that as production came to be increasingly automated and raw physical strength therefore became less significant in the workplace, the difference between men and women would shrink.
Pause there. Marx, Engels, technological innovation, blurring lines. Go ahead.
Of
envisaging.
A world where a Caitlyn Jenner would be possible. But the link to technology is important. We might also note that Nietzsche's anti-metaphysical philosophy, with its stress on how we ourselves have a godlike power to create truth, also lends itself to the repudiation of stable categories such as male and female.
So pause there. Remember, Nietzsche was tear down all the norms and the God-man or the Superman, if you remember that part when we covered it. Go ahead.
Both Marx and Nietzsche prove important to the rise of gender theory. In the context of this book's narrative, we might also add that the psychologizing of the self that we have described also opens possibilities for trans ideology.
And this is the flow from the Romantics, right, where we just got to get back to nature in order to find ourselves, and then quickly with Descartes, I think, therefore I am the source of reality. Go ahead.
This essentially grants the givenness of the physical body less authority than the mind in determining identity. Indeed, the body is instrumental, is an instrument or the raw material for realizing or expressing identity as determined by the will.
Perfect, thank you. So we've gone past the idea of being able to physically identify man and woman based on their physicality in gender theory, the academic world. I think most people are not that way, but that's in the academic world. So progressing through this, that's kind of how we got there. You can see the other chapters feeding up into this one. So let's go forward. Page 132. Yes.
I just think it's interesting the appeal of the sin of homosexuality and lesbianism. The appeal is in breaking a law that is existent. So you feel the pressure of the law, and the appeal is to go against that law. I mean, we still see that in Eastern countries where men, it's very masculine in those countries to have young boys, sadly.
Yeah.
And so it's that appeal is rebelling against God by transgressing His law. And I think the shift happened when we have this Marxist idea that we must actually tear down the law and set up a new law to that normalizing. And so that's that shift from where we've been to where we are now, it seems.
It's exactly right. And it's the circular nature of all of those philosophies, because this constant breaking out or tearing down or revolution, what happens when it's all done and there's nothing left? What do you rebel against? What do you revolt against? Where do you go from there?
When you become the oppressor, now somebody has to revolt against you.
And that's where we're headed. Mr. Dice, you just earned yourself some reading time. Excellent. I love these volunteers. All right, page 132, the quote at the bottom, "One is not born, but rather becomes woman." Go ahead and stand up nice and loud. Do you see it there? Okay, so this is Simone de Beauvoir, French philosopher, book 1949, The Second Sex. So it's a book about feminism, not about lesbianism. Go ahead.
One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates as an intermediary product between the male and the eunuch that is called feminine.
Perfect. That's a shift. 1949. And the purpose of this was feminism. It was not lesbianism. It was feminism. And there's truths there. Nathan was just saying it. Isn't masculinity defined in America like John Wayne and defined in Europe a different way? Yeah, kind of. There's truths there about femininity. What's femininity like in the U.S. versus Asia? There's some differences there, but not at the essence level. So again, it's Satan taking things that are true and pushing them over. That's that pendulum. It's like there's a bandwidth of true here, but then, oh yeah, let's get it swinging. Right? All right, we're going to skip along here. Let's go to our examples, page 134 at the bottom. 134 at the bottom. Nikki, could I ask you to read? 134 at the bottom, there's a quote there, when my partner began his gender transition. Now listen to this intro. Nothing reveals the problem, and this is the problem of transgenderism, how it redefines everything. Nothing reveals that problem more dramatically than the personal testimonies of those impacted. This is the words of a lesbian living with a partner who transitioned from female to male. You're welcome for that.
When my partner began his gender transition, my lesbian identity had been central to my life and my sense of self for well over a decade.
Her worship.
And I didn't know what this transition made me. Some people told me I was obviously still a lesbian, but it was just as obvious to others that I was now straight or bisexual. It wasn't obvious to me at all, and I struggled with it for a long time. Now I've been the partner of a trans man for as long as I was a lesbian, and I've gotten comfortable just not having a name for what I think I am. I think of myself as part of the family of queers and trans people.
Yikes.
Can you just say for that, please?
It's right here. It's right here. She says, I'm part of the what? The family of queer and trans people that have always existed since the beginning of time, always will exist, and it's important because I sit here and I'm moving the rights of blah, 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 blah. Yes, sir. Aiden.
This is where, the Orwellian concept of doublethink.
Yes, doublethink.
Because, these are ideologies all within the family that conflict with each other.
That's right.
Like homosexuals, it's supposedly, you're born that way, there's nothing you can do about it, you can change it, that's who you are.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get to the transgenderism, which they all, for some reason, support each other, they say, no, you can change this daily if you want.
Yeah, so, and what he's saying there is that this is where the conflict comes in, and that's exactly right. So let's read the next one. Who have I not picked on? Let's see. Let's do Joe. Let's do Joe. And then Jackie, you'll be next. The quote. 135, it is not transphobic. Do you see that one?
Yeah.
Okay, so pause there. So this is a different take. This is a different take. This is Andrew Sullivan, a gay man and an exceptionally sharp-witted and insightful journalist, and he made this comment in the New York Magazine in 2019. Go ahead.
It is not transphobic for a gay man not to be attracted to a trans man. It is close to definitional. The core of the traditional gay claim is that there is indeed a very big difference between male and female, that the difference matters, and without it, homosexuality would make no sense at all. If it's all a free and fluid, non-binary choice of gender and sexual partners, a choice to have sex exclusively with the same sex would not be an expression of our identity, but a form of sexist bigotry, would it not?
Do you see how he's pointing out the conflicts here? 2 secs. He's saying that actually the differences between men and women really do matter. And then he's also saying, look, if I'm engaging in a choice to have sex exclusively with the same sex, with just that one, aren't I a bigot? In a sense, yes, because you're discriminating against a swath of people. Aiden and then Mary.
In conversations with these people, it's why the language matters so much and why they're coming after the things so much, because they differentiate between biology and gender expression.
Yes.
But even that falls apart as you keep going, because then what is the difference between gender expression and your biology, and then, okay, which one matters more? And as you're going through conversations with these people, you will see the language tie itself up in knots.
Yes.
Trying to differentiate the two, but also connect the two. So when they're doing this, how are they keeping this internally with each other? Because you're trying to reconcile the language with these people,
Mm-hmm.
but you're having these conversations and they're having these conversations. So I know we're kind of seeing it already, but with this language, how has this not been a problem earlier?
Yeah, with this language,
Silence of dissent.
silence of dissent, that's on our side.
They silence the dissenters within their own.
Oh, they silence the dissenters. I beg your pardon. Yes, there is a cancel culture out there and has been. The academic culture has been banding this stuff around, trying to decide on the terms and the language and all of that stuff, because if you don't create the right categories of language, by the way, language matters. In the book of James, the tongue steers the ship. The tongue is the bit in the horse's mouth, steers the whole horse. Language matters. Language creates categories. We didn't used to call trans people. We used to call them cross-dressers. But we created a category for this, or they did, with language. Mary.
We're creating more, or they're creating more victims, because now homosexuals can be transphobic. That's a problem.
Yes.
That's the bigoted part of it.
Mary's saying they're creating more victims because now a homosexual person can actually be transphobic, which is just what he said. Or a bigot, which is also what he said. So this is good. This is good. All right, let's go to consequences as this goes forward. I really want to get to the last part. So on page 136, trans ideology and feminism. Here's another big clash. Another big clash. And again, this is where these things come crashing in together. So you've got, and I'm just going to read this and then we're going to go on to the legal ramifications because that's really big. The difficulty of relating the T to the LGB finds a parallel in the response of feminists to the trans movement. Feminism is now bitterly divided between those who affirm trans women as true women and those who repudiate such, seeing them as men who are trying to deny the male privilege that has been their invisible birthright and steal false identifications with female victimhood. Now we're all the way back to the 80s. Do you remember? They united and they coalesced for power and for scale, but those ruptures, those fissures of disagreement never went away. And now there's an external pressure called trans that's pushing this even further down the road. The latter, those that disagree from the feminist side, those have been dubbed TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling. Very much standing against the idea that we're going to talk about the legal ramifications of this in a minute and why she was so adamant about this. But she is a TERF. A pejorative term that's intended to marginalize those who object to the increasingly dominant orthodoxy, there's that word, regarding sex and gender. So we have orthodoxy. We have terminology. We have a sense of past. We have a sense of the future. We have a sense of place in the present. We have a cause that's bigger than ourselves that we all need to rally and unite against. This is all sounding very familiar. Very familiar. All right, Jackie, you're up. Let's go to page 144. There's a lot in here that we're not talking about. But I think what's important is page 144 and following, he really hits a section. Trans ideology can't be avoided. And what he's talking about here is the way that our legal environment, our regulatory environment, is impacted by this ideology and what that caused to shift. And this is the stuff that's made the headlines in the last 3, 4, 5 years. So Jackie, if you would read 144, the first paragraph under trans ideology cannot be avoided. It begins, the trans issue has become.
The trans issue has become the most pressing and intrusive aspect of the LGBTQ plus transformation of society. While gay marriage has created problems for Christian florists and cake bakers, it is arguable that most of us have not found it to impinge uncomfortably upon our lives in any obvious way. Trans ideology, however, is different. This is because so much of traditional society has been shaped by the assumed reality of the gender binary. From school bathroom facilities to sports to prisons to hospital wards and beyond, The basic distinction between male and female is all pervasive. It shapes notions of privacy and safety. It has historically informed ideas of good manners and decorum, of modesty and public behavior. But when the binary comes to be seen as a mere social construction designed for the purpose of oppression, everything must change. And such change will be impossible for anyone to avoid or ignore precisely because it has such serious implications for public spaces and even for the relationships of parents, children, and the state.
Thank you. So we see it all here. Public bathrooms, sports, hospital wards, prisons. And the idea is that you take a biological man who thinks he's a woman and put them into a female environment. Safety, privacy, and switch it back and forth. Creates all kinds of issues. Now there was this already, the question of a gay man coaching a boys basketball team, a boys whatever team, and then there's the locker room, and what is, normally it's not an issue. But now you have this man that says he's attracted to the same sex and he's in the locker room with these boys, and vice versa. But this crosses that next boundary. So now it's starting to work itself out. Alan, could I get you to read for us as well? We're going to see how this works, and it's amazing. 145 at the top of the page, just start reading. In a significant Supreme Court case.
In a significant Supreme Court case in 2020, Bostic versus Clayton County, the court decided by 6-3 majority that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act applied to trans individuals.
So pause there. 2020 is the Trump Supreme Court. This is the conservative majority Supreme Court decided 6-3 this. Go ahead.
Title VII was originally intended to protect people, i.e. women, in the workplace from discrimination on the basis of sex. By applying Title VII to trans individuals, the Supreme Court basically accepted the detachment of gender from biological sex and granted legal status to the inner psychological convictions of those who believe themselves to be men trapped in the bodies of women or women trapped in the bodies of men. Trans ideology was thus confirmed as the law of the land when it came to matters of employment.
Thank you, Alan. So it says it was confirmed as law. I think it was interpreted as law, because I don't recall Congress ever passing a law saying this, but took existing law and interpreted it this way. But that's how we got Roe v. Wade. I mean, that lasted for 50 years. Chris, could I ask you to read the next paragraph? Same page, 145, paragraph right in the middle.
I am willing, Jason.
You are willing. Your books aren't flying at you. Oh, there we go. All right, page 145, right in the middle, the paragraph begins, the author of the majority decision, Neil Gorsuch.
The author of the majority decision, Justice Neil Gorsuch, was careful to stress that this ruling was narrowly focused upon the workplace and not to be seen as having immediate relevance beyond that. But of course, once trans ideology has legal status in one area, it is hard, even perhaps unreasonable, to keep it confined there. Within hours of his inauguration as president, Joe Biden signed into law an executive order preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Among other things, this order required public schools to open women's restrooms and changing rooms to biological men identifying as women. Women's sports, too, must be open to biological men. In short, it took the underlying philosophy of Justice Gorsuch and applied it to the area of education, citing Title VII as it did so.
Pause there. Existing law from 1964 interpreted this way, and then an executive order to power that through into all of the different ways that an executive order can power something through. Federal level, public schools, anything that receives federal money, we've seen it. And then we've seen it go back the other way just recently with Trump. I'm sure that one of his 200 executive orders was the other direction. But we don't have a law against this. What we have is an interpretation by the Supreme Court that says this is the way to interpret it, and then we have a president that goes, okay. Now we got another president that says, no, this way. We still have that precedent. And the impacts over that last 4 years were profound and created amazing conversations. Keep going, if you would, please.
What this means is that the trans ideology now has a grip on the law in such a way that it's going to be impossible to avoid. If you employ people, if you work with people, if your children go to the public schools, you're going to find the trans question pressing upon you. It is no longer sufficient to plead individual moral scruples with regard to these things, any more than it is deemed accessible in matters of racial segregation. Trans rights are now civil rights, and those with principled objections have no obvious recourse by which they might protect themselves.
That's good right there. Thank you, Chris. So what we see here then is psychological choices being codified through a Supreme Court decision and then executive orders back and forth as additional rights. As additional rights. So the arguments at the beginning of the book about plastic people, that we shape ourselves because of the way that we think about ourselves, that physicality is not our definition, but rather our own identity, our own choices are how we define ourselves. That is now being pushed through an interpretation of laws from the 1960s into our present day. Currently pushed back, but there for the taking to the next administration if that happens. So let's go ahead and finish. And let's talk about the impact. So we just said, okay, trans now seems to have its own set of civil rights, or now it's part of the civil rights package. But now what we're seeing is that because those quote-unquote civil rights are there, now they're starting to curtail constitutionalized civil rights, which we'll read about right now. Nice and loud. Johnny, can you read for us? Page 146, right in the middle, trans ideology increasingly shapes corporate policies. So let me give you a background. Corporate policies, right? The Fortune 500 corporations in the world, the biggest corporations in the world, right? How do they all agree on something? Well, they don't. And they're all in different businesses. However, cross-investing by large retirement funds, the three largest retirement funds in the world, they have trillions of dollars of assets. State Street, what's the other ones? Blackstone, BlackRock, and Vanguard. Vanguard, those three. Each of them swings trillions of dollars. When you invest $1 trillion into a corporation, not $1 trillion, hundreds of billions of dollars into a corporation, what does that buy you? Board seats. Voting board seats by proxy. And the bigger your dollar investment, the more swing you have on a board. So now we're down to 3 large, multi-trillion-dollar entities. Just 3. And then there's a corporate leadership of those 3, consisting of maybe 10 to 15 to 20 people at the top that take policy. Now it's very small. Very small. Hold on, we got to get our reading in. Go ahead and read this. Corporate policies, because this is new. We were. Yep.
Trans ideology increasingly shapes corporate policies too. The banning of Brian T. Anderson's thoughtful and well-researched book, When Harry Became Sally, by Amazon, February 2021, was an interesting move. Mao, Hitler, and Stalin remained authors in good standing. The company sent out numerous emails in that very month, encouraging customers to purchase Technological Slavery by Theodore
Kaczynski.
Kaczynski is better known as the Unabomber, the United States' most infamous homegrown terrorist. This work and his earlier manifesto are still available via Amazon. Yet even in the worst case scenario, Anderson's book is unlikely to cause a world war, lead to millions of deaths by famine, or inspire a domestic bombing campaign.
So pause there. So what he's saying is Ryan Anderson came out with this book in 2021 that he says was thoughtful, well-researched, sensitive to both sides, and it was about this idea of trans when Harry became Sally. The book was banned by Amazon. And what he's saying is at the same time, Amazon was still selling Mein Kampf by Hitler, Communist Manifesto by Marx, still selling Theodore Kaczynski, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber's Manifesto, and his life story. That was all okay. But this thoughtful, well-balanced treatment of trans, banned from Amazon. Now, that's okay, but then the consequences continue.
Somehow, Anderson had committed a more serious crime in the modern therapeutic world. He had challenged the dominant narrative of the trans revolution and called into question whether it really was deliberating on the promises it made.
Keep going.
The banning of Anderson's book, like the Bostic ruling and the Biden executive order, had implications for all of them. Amazon has a vice-like grip on book sales in the United States and increasingly elsewhere. A book denied a platform at Amazon is a book likely to be far less attractive to a publisher as a product, or indeed to an author as a project. This is not old-style censorship by government of the kind that characterized the Soviet Union. It is censorship via corporate economic power. But in its censorship, it nonetheless here in the service of trans ideology, but with potential implications for anything with which the Amazon executives care to disagree.
Thank you. So what we have here isn't necessarily new, it's censorship. But we're at a point right now technologically where the distribution channels of thought and products are uniquely choked. Uniquely choked. We used to have 4 or 5 newspapers in every major city. The Los Angeles Herald, the Los Angeles Examiner, the Los Angeles Times, right? Now there's one barely hanging on. So the news feed. We used to have Book Barn, Barnes & Noble, Bookstar. We used to have, and then all the independent bookstores. Almost all of them are gone, and half of Barnes & Noble is board games. So you have choke points that are unique right now. Now those are going to widen back out. They always do. If you think about the turn of the century, the 1800s into the 1900s, there were only a couple of railroads you could get. So you would only be able to ship supplies, on Carnegie Steel or whatever. Their choke points exist when technological means accelerate. But then they blow back again because this type of thing happens and people say, well, that's ridiculous. I'm going to start my own. Which is great, as long as government doesn't get in the way. But when we have those choke points, then we have the unique opportunity to censor. And I think in some ways this has rolled itself back just in the last 3 or 4 months. Because what we had was several titans of industry standing on the platform with the president that vehemently disagreed with what they'd done over the last 5 years. We had the president and CEO of Apple, Amazon, Google was there. I mean, these folks, even big investors were there, and this was clearly administration going differently than what had happened in the last 4 or 5 years. So maybe this has shifted, we don't know. But what this is unique in this time period as far as how it's being done, but censorship as a whole is not unique. At the end of the day, though, Truman's point, and this just to summarize, and we'll go on from here to chapter 8, but the Truman's big point is that you've got something like this that was, he called it the most successful of these in the last 40, 50 years. It went all the way up to get a Supreme Court interpretation that then became an executive order that then ended up with men and women's sports, locker rooms, prisons, etc. And that's how it can work. That's how it can work. So chapter 8 next week. Brad, could you close us in prayer?